An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Laboo, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Laboo held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Laboo raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Laboo was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Laboo who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Laboo hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Laboo smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too. Peppa-Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. "Did you draw these?" George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. "Just a coincidence," Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller, the figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me." But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank, arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore." In Peppa's room, there had always been one familiar window, looking out onto the garden. But one morning, she noticed something new. On the wall beside her bed, there was now another window. Narrow, with a cracked frame and dim, misted glass. It looked old, as if it had been there for many years, though it had never been there before. Peppa stepped closer. Beyond this window, there was no familiar yard or swings. Instead, a dark forest stretched out, wrapped in grey fog. Tall trees rose upward, their branches intertwining into black patterns. In the distance, among the trunks, stood a figure. It was motionless, yet in its outline, there was something alive. The next day, the figure was closer. Through the mist, Peppa could make out sharp ears, huge round eyes, and a smile too wide to be real. It was Laboo. His silhouette grew darker and clearer, and it seemed that each day he took another step closer to the window. Peppa tried to tell Mummy Pig, "Mummy, there's a new window in my room. There's a forest outside it, and someone is standing there." But as soon as Mummy walked into the room, the second window vanished. The wall was ordinary again. "You must have dreamed it, Peppa," Mummy Pig said, patting her daughter's head before leaving. That night, however, Peppa woke again to see the window had returned. In the fog, Laboo stood much closer. His eyes glowed yellow, and Peppa felt the cold from his gaze spread through the room. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, but still couldn't fall asleep. Each morning, the figure was nearer. On the third day, Laboo stood almost at the forest's edge, his long arms stretching forward as if trying to touch the glass. Peppa called her mother again, but the window disappeared the moment she entered. "Enough of this imagination," Mummy Pig said firmly. "There's nothing wrong in your room?" But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. On the fourth night, a strange sound woke her. From the window came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across glass. Terrified, Peppa watched as the shadowy figure in the mist lifted its head. Laboo was right there now. His glowing eyes stared directly at the level of her bed. In the morning, marks appeared on the glass of the second window, as though someone had scraped it with sharp nails. And at the bottom corner, words were etched, carved from the inside. "You look through the window, but I am inside." Peppa's heart sank. She ran to fetch her mother and tried to show her the writing, but when they returned, the window had vanished again. That night, Peppa didn't go to sleep. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the wall where the window would appear. When the clock hands passed midnight, it returned. Laboo was now standing directly behind the glass. His smile was wider than ever. He didn't move, but Peppa could clearly hear a whisper in her head. "Open the window. I'm waiting for you." She gripped the windowsill tightly, trying not to move. In the silence, she heard only her own breathing, shallow and uneven. Suddenly, the glass trembled slightly, as if someone was pressing against it from the forest side. Peppa screamed, and in that instant, everything vanished. The room was ordinary once more. Only a small, damp sprig of pine needles lay on the floor. Now, every morning, Peppa wondered if the second window would appear again, and every night, it did. Laboo was closer each time, and Peppa knew one day he would no longer remain behind the glass. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared, doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty, the shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere.
Peppa Pig, the mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been gray for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was. Still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred, like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. A whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask. You are me. You were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed. Faces faded. First George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar. No toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within. I was...
Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Laboo. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, "Peppa and Lucy." Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Laboo, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Laboo was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Laboo sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Laboo. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed. And no one, except Laboo, knew where Peppa had gone. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him. "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. They were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if 2 more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside.